Hey everybody, welcome to week 5 of Jesus and the Gospels. In this week's episode, we're going to be talking about the history behind the New Testament, specifically behind the Gospels. This week's lecture is going to be a lot of history, a lot of stuff about ancient empires, and a lot of names that are squirrely and don't necessarily fit well into English. Please understand, I am not out to get you with names and dates. This is not a history class. What I would much rather see happen is that you develop a feel for how the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament interplays with how we read the Gospels themselves. This is background information. This is the stuff we have to cover so that when we delve into the Gospels themselves, things make a little bit more sense than they might otherwise make. So, with that in mind, buckle up for what is probably going to be a long lecture, but all of this material is coming straight out of your textbook. We have to get through it, we need to digest it, so that you can have this information as we move forward into the Gospels. Okay, so a funny thing happens if you read the Bible straight through. Start with Genesis 1 and go all the way through the last page of Revelation. You'll notice a curious thing happens somewhere about the end of Malachi. There's a fundamental gap that never gets explained in the New Testament. That is the gap in the historical and cultural changes that have happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Primarily, our concern is what empires have taken over or what cultural events have happened that lead up to the birth of Jesus and eventually the birth of Christianity. So, let's remember a couple of things if we take the view from the Bible. The Old Testament ends with Cyrus, who is the conquering ruler. He conquers the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar, and decides to let the Jewish people go home. So they've been in exile for about 70 years, and he's going to let them go home. And not only that, he's going to give them tax money to rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. So this is good news, and the Old Testament kind of ends on a high note because, yay, we get to go home and rebuild the temple. Well, if you turn the page to Matthew chapter 1, you'll notice that all of a sudden there's this completely different political structure happening. Nobody's heard of Cyrus, and an extraordinary amount of time seems to have passed in just the turn of that one page. Well, it turns out that Rome is fully in control on page 1 of the New Testament, and that there's all these new groups around that we haven't really been introduced to that thoroughly. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, all these other groups that we're just supposed to know who they are and what they're about on page 1 of Matthew. So it turns out there's a 400-year gap between the close of Malachi and the opening of Matthew. So that 400-year gap had a lot happening in it, and we're going to talk about that tonight. But for those of you who are now just professional Bible nerds who've been keeping up with the trajectory of this class, you now know that Matthew is not chronologically the first book of the New Testament. In fact, none of the Gospels were written first. It turns out that the letters of Paul are the oldest letters we have in the New Testament. So, we technically ought to say that there's a 400-year gap between the closing of Malachi and the writing of 1 Thessalonians. But that just doesn't roll off the tongue as easily as the 400-year gap between the closing of Malachi and the opening of Matthew. So that's the language we're going to go with. But we know better. The good news is we know a lot of information about that time period from sources outside of the Bible. This is a helpful time to remind you that sources from outside the Bible about the Bible are very valuable to us. Remember our conversation 2 weeks ago about Josephus and how important his works are to our study of the Bible. So remember, when we lean on non-biblical sources, we're not picking on the Bible in any sort of way. We're just trying to reinforce what the Bible assumes we already know. I mean, for goodness sake, on the first page of Matthew, we're supposed to know all this important stuff about the genealogy of Jesus and who's emperor of what and all these things. We need some help understanding what the Bible says. All right, so a little bit of Old Testament history. You need to know that 3 foreign powers occupied the Jewish territories during the narrative of the Old Testament. That is, from the establishment of the Jewish state to the very last page of Malachi. There are 3 big empires. But before that, I want you to remember one key thing. You remember in the Old Testament when the Jewish nation is officially made. You got 3 kings. You've got Saul, you've got David, and you've got Solomon. Saul starts off as good king. The people want a king. They get a king. Saul's good king turns out to be bad king. David comes in to take over for the bad king Saul. David does good at the beginning, but then he has this thing with Bathsheba and a couple of other major failures. And so he loses favor. Well, then Solomon comes along. And when Solomon dies, the Jewish empire, the nation of Israel, gets split into 2 pieces, north and south. The northern chunk was called Israel, and the bottom chunk was called Judah. That gets people confused a lot because they think, wait, Israel is the whole thing. No. Israel was just the northern chunk that was left over after the split at Solomon's death. All right, so that's important because the first foreign power to come in and dominate these territories was the Assyrian Empire. They come down from the north and just whack the nation of Israel, burn it to the ground, and basically just exile the people. So we're talking about the now smaller chunk that was called Israel. Well, then later, the Babylonian Empire comes along and whacks Jerusalem. That was then the nation of Judah. This is where you read about the exiles going off into captivity in Babylon. You've got Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. You've got Daniel and all the stories that go along with that. This is where the exile happens, which is the most culture and religion shaping event of the Old Testament. It really just destroyed the hearts of the people. Well, then, as we mentioned a few moments ago, Cyrus comes in, or Philip of Macedon, and then eventually Cyrus, comes in and knocks out the Persian Empire that had taken over for the Babylonian Empire. So they come in, they whack the Babylonians, say, hey, everybody can go home, rebuild your temple, rebuild your walls, yay, everything's happy. The good news is these are described in pretty good detail in the Old Testament, so we can follow along with that pretty well. Now, some major shifts happened after the last page of Malachi and before the first page of Matthew that deserve our attention because this may be stuff you've never heard of before. First, the Persians fell to the Greeks. Now, you've seen the movie The 300, and you may have done a little reading on that. And it's really interesting how the Greeks began to dominate their portion of the Mediterranean for a while. So, Philip of Macedon effectively conquers the Mediterranean basin. And then when he is off the scene, his son Alexander the Great takes over for him, and really just, that boy just takes over the world. He's got a great army behind him. He's got really a great strategy. And so his plan is to conquer the world and spread Greek culture. We call this Hellenization, which is going to play a very key role in our discussion in just a little while. But for now, understand that Alexander the Great conquered the known world. It's in his writings, he starts marching through what we would eventually call India, and he fully expects to find the edge of the world. I mean, he expects to just be walking along one day and come to where the world stops. He never expected it to just keep going. So eventually he turns around, he gets sick in Babylon, and dies at the age of 33, which is getting younger every day, I might add. Well, on his death, he leaves his empire to his three generals. Only two of them merit your concern at this point. The Ptolemies, and that's a fun word to say because it starts with a P and a T. The Ptolemies ruled from Egypt. So they got Egypt and the southern portion of the Mediterranean basin, which we don't think of that as being that strategically important, especially compared to Rome. But please understand, at that time, Egypt was still a very powerful territory and city-state. That was an anchor for whoever was ruling at the time. Then you've got the Seleucids, who were ruling from Syria, which was to the north of Jerusalem. They kind of controlled the what we would think of as the northern section of the world. So you've got these two guys fighting north and south, and guess who is sandwiched smack dab in the middle? That's right, our dear friend city, Jerusalem. So Alexander dies. His two generals set up camp north and south of the city, and they're both going to be fighting over Jerusalem. Things were pretty good for a while under the Ptolemies in Egypt. They wanted to reinforce Jewish culture. They were happy with leaving the Jews alone to worship as they saw fit. And interestingly enough, a very important thing happened in this period. Because it was relatively peaceful, and because the people were so enamored by Greek life and Greek culture, they began to move farther and farther away from using Hebrew as their own language, instead adopting Greek. Well, it got so bad, well, bad's not the right word, it got so pronounced of a difference that they actually commissioned scholars to translate their holy scriptures, the law, into Greek. I happen to have a copy of that. It's called the Septuagint. This is it. My copy is in Greek, as it's supposed to be. It is a very thick tome. It's small, though, on purpose. This is actually meant to be used in the pulpit somewhere. So, anywho, it's just Greek. It's a Greek version of the Old Testament, pretty much. Well, the fact that this book exists is a pretty big deal when you consider that in our time, we're doing our dead level best to try and reach back through the old language translations to get back to the original words of Jesus or the original words of Paul or whatever. We're actually trying to go backwards in language. At this time in Jewish history, they were trying to move forward in language. They were trying to say, you know what, we're not speaking Hebrew. Our children can't read Hebrew anymore. How about we have a usable translation of our Holy Scriptures? So the Septuagint was generated, and it became the Old Testament, well, what we call the Old Testament, what they would call the Bible, for all these people around the world who were practicing Jews. Now, it is also very important for you to understand that the Septuagint is abbreviated LXX. That's the Roman numbers for 70. You'll see that pop up in our textbook or in other discussions we may have. Just don't forget that. Don't let it throw you off. As these stories tend to go, nothing stayed good forever. The Seleucids in the northern region of Alexander's former empire wanted to take over control of the whole thing. So eventually they defeated the Ptolemies and therefore defeated Egypt at Panion and started making an empire that stretched all the way from Egypt to Syria. Now remember, Egypt is a really big deal still at this time. Syria is strategically important and also another capital city. So what you have is one empire covering basically the eastern Mediterranean basin. Stretching north to south, you've got trade routes, you've got water access, you've got really just a really powerful empire forming over there under the Seleucids. Well, now, the Seleucids were not kind rulers toward the Jews. They really wanted everybody to be Greek. They wanted not to necessarily be Greek, but to speak Greek and sort of restore the glory of Alexander's empire. Well, what's interesting is after they conquered the eastern Mediterranean basin, they wanted to conquer Greece. All right, so get this. The folks that originally were fighting for Greece under Alexander the Great, a couple of generations later, now they want to turn and conquer Greece. So that sort of gives you a highlight into um, how messed up the Seleucids were. They wanted their version of Greek life to be all of Greek life. So anyway, they turn their eyes westward and they're about to conquer Greece. Well, then there's these new kids that you may have heard of. They're the Romans. At this point, they've conquered Italy and some of the surrounding territories, and they are on the up and up. They've got this army, they've got Greek culture infused in their society. And they think that the Seleucids marching west is probably a bit too much. So they come to the aid of Greece. They whack the Seleucids and send them home packing. But they didn't just send them home, they sent them home with a heck of a tax bill every year. And just to add insult to injury, they took the Seleucid king's son hostage and took him back to Rome to raise him. This is, I mean, that's just classic barbarism, where you snatch up the children of the guy you just conquered and you raise them as though they were your own. We saw this with Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, where they put up this fight about how they're not going to eat the meats and drink the wines at the king's table. They're going to eat fruits and vegetables, and after 40 days, we'll see who's healthier. It's the exact same thing. You know, the very reason you take captives and take hostages is to get them to buy into your culture, so that when you send them back home, now they're your friends and not your enemies. So Rome does this with the son of the Seleucid king, and eventually his name becomes Antiochus. So he comes home after a while, and he just, man, he's just not a kind dude. He has now gotten the Greek influence of his father and the Roman militarism and suppression of his upbringing in Rome. So this pays off in higher taxes and forced Hellenization of the Jewish people. Now a note about Hellenization. I've used that word several times in this lecture. We need to talk about it and why it's very important for what happens in the New Testament. So Alexander the Great was basically a colonist. He made the same deal with everybody. He said, look, we can fight. My army's going to whoop your army. You're going to lose a lot of good men. And then I'm going to do whatever I want to with your city. Or you can not fight. Let me prop up your culture a little bit. We'll build you, we'll build you a theater. We'll build you some public baths. We'll build you a school. We'll build you a gymnasium. We'll basically make your society stronger. Now it'll be Greek. We're going to impose Greek life on you, whether you like it or not. But at least you won't be dead. So most people accept it, especially the Jewish people. When Alexander came knocking on Jerusalem's door, they're like, yeah, fine, come on, build up what you want, build your temples, build your schools, whatever you want. Just don't whack us. And in a lot of cultures, not just in Jerusalem, but in a lot of cultures that Alexander conquered, this was seen as a good thing. They knew that Greek culture was high society, that it was progress and innovation and economics and philosophy. It was all these things that they had heard about. And now here comes this guy saying, look, you pay your taxes, you behave well, you get the benefits of this society. Okay, fine. Well, in most civilizations, the people making those decisions of whether or not to accept or reject the conqueror Alexander, it was the elites, it was the aristocrats, it was the aristocracy, it was the rich, the landed, the property owners, the gentry. It was the 1%, to borrow a phrase from our culture. So the upper classes generally embraced Alexander and his Greek lifestyle. But then the lower classes, who didn't really have a say in it to begin with, other than the fact that they would have been the soldiers who had gotten killed in the first place, they began to resent Greek culture because it was a deterioration of their sacred culture. So, in most cultures, and especially in the Jewish camps, we see the development of two distinct cultures. One, the upper class and the sophisticated and the elite, who want to side with Alexander the Great and with his Greek culture. Those are usually manifested as the Sadducees in the New Testament. And then you have the more conservative, you might say the fundamentalists, the lower class folks who, um, they're the ones that they're screaming, "I want my country back." Um, those are the Pharisees and the Essenes who are clinging to the law, who are clinging to their interpretation of worship, and who see Hellenization as something foreign and alien. Neither side is necessarily right or wrong, but I hope you can understand how it is Alexander's conquest that really sets all this in motion. All right, so back to Antiochus. Um, Antiochus comes home from Rome. He is grumpy. He really just does not like the Jewish culture to begin with. So he decides to do the most rational thing possible. Oh, let's try and eliminate a centuries old form of worship that is fundamentally rooted to worshiping and sacrificing in one specific temple and a lifestyle defined by very strange rules. So he outlaws, he just outlaws temple worship, circumcision, and he burns copies of the law. My goodness, this dude. So think about what that does. He effectively says you can't go to church anymore. You can't participate in the fundamental physical rite of your religion. That would be circumcision. Oh yeah, and then he's going to burn all the Bibles that he finds. This is he's striking out here. He thinks that he's got the military and cultural momentum to actually win. And sort of the last straw is his setup of an altar to Zeus in the temple. He's just, he's just really throwing an insult to the Jewish people here. He's like, look, here's what I think of your temple. He builds a statue of Zeus, and just for kicks, make sure that they offer things like pig and other unclean animals as sacrifices to Zeus in the Holy of Holies in the temple. That's a bad look, even for an emperor. Well, it gets so bad that people start rebelling. The real spark that ignited the flame of rebellion happened out in one of the villages where a priest gets ordered to make a pagan sacrifice to a foreign god. He refuses. Well, then this other guy steps up. He's like, yeah, I'll do it, fine. So the old priest kills the government official and the sellout who was willing to do the sacrifice. So now he's killed two people. Well, folks kind of rally around him, and his family and all his followers head up to the hills, and they start a guerrilla war against the government. We'd call them today insurgents. Now, they did not have bombs and guns and things, but they would make little quick attacks on government agencies and government troops, and then run back into the hills where they couldn't be found again. And so they start really weakening the Seleucid government in the area through this, I hate to say it, but we'd probably call it through this terrorist campaign. And then enough folks join, enough trained soldiers join up that they actually create a formal army. Now, the original priest dies, but his son Judas goes by the name Judas Maccabeus, which means the hammer. That's pretty cool, right? He's the son of the priest. He leads the full-scale war, and dadgummit, they actually beat the Seleucid Empire and drive them out of Israel. It's really astounding that this little, ragtag bunch of revolutionaries drive out the well-trained army. It sounds a lot like the American Revolution. It's on a much smaller scale. Well, what I really think is cool, and your textbook just kind of flies over this with one sentence, but all right, so think back at how this lecture started. It started with King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and the splitting of the Jewish nation into a northern and southern half. Well, then Assyria comes down and whacks the north, and then Babylon. When Assyria invaded, that was the last time the Jewish people had an independent state all to their own. Fast forward now until the Maccabean Revolt and the eventual Hasmonean dynasty. That 100-ish year period was the next time that the Jewish people had any sort of independent government. It lasts for about 100 years until Rome comes and squashes them. But then, and this is so astounding, from the time Rome took over until 1942, at the end of World War II, there was no such thing as Israel. There just wasn't. It wasn't on a map. It was nothing. It was nothing there. From Rome's occupation until 1946, it's almost 2,000 years. There was just nothing there that the Jews could consider their own country. I just think that's astounding. Whichever side of the fence you fall on the Israeli-Palestinian debates, and that's not what I'm getting into. It just blows my mind that the Jewish people did not have their own government for that long. Well, 100 years seems to have been about enough for the Jewish people to self-rule. So Rome steps in. There had been a bit of a civil war between the leadership of Israel, and Rome took advantage of that and came and whacked the armies of Jerusalem and basically took over without actually destroying the city. What's interesting to note is that Rome didn't really care about this territory. It was sort of considered a backwater of the Roman Empire. In fact, its role was to serve as a buffer between the real Rome, that would be further west toward Italy, and the barbarians to the farther east, which later would actually conquer Rome. But the point is, the Israeli territory was maintained as being militarily significant, but nobody really cared. In fact, we have reason to suspect that Pontius Pilate and the other rulers who were sent to Jerusalem to be rulers were being punished for being sent there. They had offended somebody like Caesar, I don't know, and they were being punished by sent out to the backwoods of the empire. What you really need to know about Rome is that Rome installs Herod the Great as the king. He starts a little dynasty of his own. But what's important to know, and this kind of gets mentioned in your text, but I want you to know it. During that period of Jewish independence, the Jews had a really strong military, and they began to expand. And they eventually conquered some of their neighbors' territory. One of the territories they conquered is where Herod the Great was from. And now he's king. So think about how his attitude's going to be toward his new subjects. I mean, they effectively whacked his homeland and absorbed it into their empire. And now he's the king and can exact a little bit of revenge. Well, he does so. We have reference in the New Testament about his massacre of the male babies under 2 years old after the Magi visit him. Which totally lines up with other reports of how just nuts this dude was. But then, on other days, he was so desperate to be loved by his people that he expanded the temple into probably its greatest state ever. It's better even than when Solomon built it the first time. They refer to it as Herod's temple, in fact. I mean, the thing was magnificent. And it is this temple that we see Jesus preaching and teaching in. A very important note is on page 108 of your textbook, and it's about how Rome viewed Judaism and this little area. It may not have been a glamorous place to be, but at least on paper, the Jewish people were a special class of citizen. Through a long line of favors and inherited gifts, the Jewish people did not have to pay the same taxes as everybody else. They did not have to serve in the military like everybody else. They didn't have to give up their religion or worship other gods like everybody else. And eventually, when the emperors start declaring themselves to be gods, the Jewish people don't have to bow down to them. All this is very, very important, because if that special treatment had not been on paper, can you just imagine what would have happened when one of these emperors declares himself a god and the Jewish people refuse to bow down to him? Well, they'd have been quashed. I mean, they'd have been wiped off the map by the Roman legions, and we wouldn't have the history that we have. So even though this seems, it's in a little gray box on page 108, doesn't seem that important, it is critically important that the Jewish religion and the Jewish people thereby was a protected religion in the empire. It goes so far also, working in the other direction, that when Paul gets in trouble at the end of Acts and they're about to just beat him with a hose, he appeals to Caesar because he is in fact a Roman citizen of a special class, because he's from a Jewish territory. He's from one of these territories that has a special blessing on it from the Roman emperor. He can appeal to Caesar and go back to Rome, where we lose track of him at the end of Acts. So, all that to say, don't fly over the fact that Israel, Jerusalem, the Jewish people had a special place in Rome's heart legally, not culturally, but legally. And finally, we come to the end. By the time the New Testament opens, Rome is fully in control, and there is obviously some antagonism between the Jewish people of Jerusalem and the Roman authorities. We see this in the Passion narrative when Jesus gets brought up and is questioned by Pontius Pilate. We see it in the interaction and the treatment of Roman soldiers in the stories, especially the healing narratives of Jesus' ministry. It is obvious that not everybody gets along with everybody else. Well, the seeds of rebellion had already been sown. I love the 5 factors on page 114 and 115. Those 5 factors are very important. There was always this traditional conflict between the Hellenizers and the conservatives. I mentioned this earlier. This is the fight between those who wanted to adopt what was viewed as a foreign culture, a superior culture, and those who wanted to maintain a more traditional conservative approach. They already didn't like each other, so there was already some antagonism. Then you've got widespread corruption and oppression by wealthy aristocrats and landowners. This would have probably happened whether or not Rome was there. This is, again, class warfare between the 1% and the 99%. Oh, and by the way, that 1% would have sided with Rome and with the Hellenizers anyway. Then you've got, severe Roman taxation. This got better and worse depending on who was emperor and what their taxation system was and what war they were fighting at the time. Heavy-handed Roman oppression of opposition. Anytime there was even a smattering of rebellion, Rome marched the legions down the city streets and just killed people. And that eventually got under people's skin. There's a great story that we'll talk about later in the semester about a mass crucifixion in Galilee that would have happened right around the time Jesus was about 12 years old. So you can imagine Jesus and Mary and Joseph traveling back from Jerusalem to Nazareth. and just the whole time seeing people hanging on crosses all the way from Jerusalem to Galilee because they were all arrested and executed as traitors. That's a pretty powerful image. We'll talk more about that later. Well, finally, you got these Roman leaders that are just, some of them were really good managers and leaders. Some of them were not. Some managed the fact that they were a foreigner in Jewish lands well. Some of them didn't. Well, eventually the pot boils over, and in 66 CE, there's a full-out rebellion. Now, the rebellion was not really different from any of the others at the time. Rome marches the legions in and quashes the rebellion. Well, this time, though, Nero, the emperor, has had enough. He sends his general Vespasian to basically just conquer all these little holdouts of rebellion. So he starts burning cities in Galilee and Judea, eventually gets to Jerusalem, but he has to stop because, turns out Nero died and Vespasian has just been named emperor. So he turns around and bebops his way back to Rome, leaves his son Titus in charge. Now, not that Titus. He's not the one about the book in the Bible. Not that Titus. That's a different Titus. This Titus is a cruel and ruthless general who lays siege to Jerusalem for 3 years, causing mass casualties, cannibalism, murder, and looting. Eventually, Jerusalem falls. They gut the city. It's not pretty. But the people there promise they've learned their lesson. They go about their business. Well, in 132, there's another rebellion led by a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba. He declares himself to be the Messiah. Starts a full-scale revolution. Rome has had it. They send the legions to Jerusalem. They burn Jerusalem to the ground. They put up signs around Jerusalem that say, Jews stay out or we'll kill you, and create what is called the diaspora. The diaspora is the scattering of the Jewish people away from Israel all over the world. And until 1946, that was how things lasted. So that's the end of Jerusalem and the Jewish state as we know it. Now, the Gospels happen in and among all those things. Rome is in control when the Gospels open. Rome is in control when the Gospels close. So you need to be familiar with all those sections in your text about how Rome managed things. I am not going to ask you names and dates, Lord save us, but you do need to be familiar with how Rome operated, especially when it comes to the New Testament.